Hi, I'm Misty Jesse, and I welcome you to our Growing in the Word Gospel of Luke online series. Today is our final unit, Unit 6, and we'll be covering chapters 20 through 24. Before we begin, let's take a moment to clear our thoughts and open our minds and heart to the presence of God as I begin our study with a prayer. Dear God, thank you for bringing us together and providing us this opportunity to study your word. Bless us with the presence of the Holy Spirit in our lives. Throughout the Gospel of Luke, we have heard the call and response of discipleship. Help each of us to respond to God's call in our lives. Like the disciples, help us to grow our faith and stand strong against the temptations of the world. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So we open with chapter 20, and we have the scene where the authority of Jesus' teaching is challenged. And that's something that we've seen taking place throughout his ministry. Let's take a look with a reading from chapter 20, verses 1 through 4. Chapter 20, verses 1 through 4. One day, as he was teaching the people in the temple area and proclaiming the good news, the chief priests and scribes, together with the elders, approached him and said to him, "Tell us, by what authority are you doing these things? Or who is the one who gave you this authority?" He said to them in reply, "I shall ask you a question. Tell me, was John's baptism of heavenly or of human origin?" So what we have here is a reference to the temple priest and the chief priest, and those are the ones that are part of the Sanhedrin, which is the highest Jewish court. So we have these three groups approaching Jesus, we're told. We have the priests, the scribes, and the legal scholars. The elders are the chief members of the leading families and clans. Now, the Sanhedrin court, the Jewish court, has a total of 71 members. And during the time of Jesus, the Sanhedrin had authority over the religious and secular affairs in Judea. Capital cases, however, had to be referred to the Roman authority for approval. The Sanhedrin meets in the temple complex at Jerusalem. Their question to Jesus is a trap, and Jesus avoids this trap, which is a trap of blasphemy. He answers their question with a question. So he's asking them, if his authority comes from God, then they're going to claim that he's made a blasphemous statement. And that's an offense which can result in death. And he doesn't say that. He doesn't say his authority comes from God. Instead, he uses John the Baptist as an example. So he's actually looking at the prophetic tradition as his defense. And the people we know had a great respect for John the Baptism. In Judaism, the sign of a prophet is that of being God's spokesman to the people. So Jesus is putting himself as a prophet. Therefore, it's not a charge of blasphemy. And a prophet could be a male or a female. In fact, the Bible records 48 male prophets, 7 female, and 1 Gentile, which was Balaam, when we go back to the story in the Old Testament of Balaam with the talking donkey. So once again, their attempts to trap Jesus fails. In the parable of the tenant farmers, we have this presentation of the prophetic tradition. So Jesus is working with these people who are trying to trap him, and so this parable is in reference to them and also what has happened to prophets before. The vineyard he uses, remember we're talking to an agrarian culture and a society, is that fundamental symbol of Israel. The one who plants the vineyard in this parable is God. And the tenant farmers are going to be the people of Israel. So we have these series of servants, and the servants are the prophets that God sends over and over again. The son, the heir, is Jesus. Now, Jesus, in Jewish law, it says that a piece of unclaimed property by an heir can be declared ownerless and then can be claimed by someone else. Hence, in the story, we have this repeated attempt by the tenants to get rid of the claimants that the owner keeps on sending over and over again. The murder of the son in the parable takes place outside of the vineyard. It says they dragged him away and killed him. And that also reflects for us the tradition of Jesus' death, which took place outside the city walls of Jerusalem. Let's take a look at chapter 20. We're going to look at verses 14 through 19, the death of the heir. So we're on chapter 20. We're going to look at verses 14 through 19. What is it that they did to the heir? But when the tenant farmers saw him, they said to one another, "This is the heir. Let us kill him, that the inheritance may become ours." So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and put those tenant farmers to death and turn over the vineyard to others. When the people heard this, they exclaimed, "Let it not be so." But he looked at them and asked, "What then does this scripture passage mean? The stone which the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be dashed to pieces, and it will crush anyone on whom it falls." The scribes and chief priests sought to lay their hands on him at that very hour, but they feared the people, for they knew that he had addressed this parable to them. So the context in regards to the passage is referring to the arguments that Jesus is having with the Sanhedrin. And they're refusing to recognize the hand of God in John the Baptist, and they continue to refuse and see the hand of God in Jesus. And Jesus is tying his claim to divine authority by quoting Psalm 118 in regards to that cornerstone. Now, this parable provides a schism motif, one in which the leaders reject Jesus, but the people do not. And God's promise took root in the vineyard of Israel, just as he promised when he brought them back into the Holy Land. But as a result of the people's response, that vineyard is now also going to be shared with the Gentiles because the Jewish people aren't accepting the message John the Baptist and then Jesus has brought to them. The parable creates this really hostile and adverse reaction among the scribes and the chief priests because they know it's addressed to them. So we have these tensions continuing to mount between them and Jesus. So here we have an example of the desert vineyard. In desert agriculture, you'll see throughout parts of the Middle East. And another example of desert agriculture. In Israel, they were able to develop this incredible system of capturing the water and keeping it within containment with like an underground sprinkler system. So very little evaporation. And in fact, it's been so effective that other countries in the area come to learn and to use this method of being able to actually grow things in the desert terrain by making very specific use of the water. Now, the scribes and the chief priests, they're quite relentless and they keep trying to trap Jesus. So we next move into a scene with the paying of taxes in regards to the tax payment. Roman coinage was very symbolic for Jews because it represented the paying of taxes to the emperor. And it reminds them that while they're under subjugation to a foreign power. And the face on the coinage, the denarius, has the image of Tiberius Caesar, which Jews find very offensive. First of all, it reminds them that they're not an independent nation any longer, but it's also a graven image, which is something that's not accepted in their faith. As a subject people in the Roman Empire, the Jews have to use the currency of the empire for paying taxes to the conqueror, the Romans. So it's forcing Jews to become a part of Roman paganism when they're using those kinds of coins. The question addressed Jesus concerns the legality of taxes, which requires the handling of idols, which refers to those graven images on the coins. And so Jesus avoids that trap. He doesn't focus on being defiled because of paying Roman taxes. Instead, what he focuses on is what it means to be righteous before God. Again, Jesus' response to those trying to trap fail, because Jesus shows that he's not a political revolutionary who challenges Rome, nor is he a nationalist. So no one can charge Jesus with political subversion. So here we have an example of the Roman coin with Tiberius Caesar. The point Jesus is making is that people who bear the image of God ought to give themselves to God alone, and that we are all made in the image of God. They continue to harass Jesus, these leaders, and follow him around. They're very intent on trying to trap him. And now the subject has to do with resurrection. Now, within Judaism, we talked about the different sects that were around at the time of Jesus: the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes, and then the Zealots. Now, the Sadducees had a different view on faith to that of the Pharisees. They were strict believers in only the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. So they only looked at the writings of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Versus the Pharisees, they also believe in the writings of the prophets and the historical writings. So they believe in what we come to know as the entire Old Testament. They also, as a result, believe in the resurrection, because there's references to that in these historical writings and the writings of the prophets. But the Sadducees don't, because there's no reference to resurrection in those first 5 books. It's all about the law and how the Israelites came to be. Now, the Sadducees are also the aristocratic temple cult, versus the Pharisees support the synagogue movement, which happened during the various diasporas. So when they no longer had access to the temple in Jerusalem, they're the ones that kept the religion alive by forming community centers to practice the faith, to have social gatherings, which we know as synagogues. So this issue that the Sadducees bring now before Jesus addresses levirate marriage and resurrection. By Jewish law, a widow's brother-in-law marries the widow to maintain lands in the family and ensure that the family name continues. So in this case, the widow is married several times to a succession of brothers. The question is, which brother will she be the wife of in resurrection? So Jesus responds to them by explaining the nature of a resurrected life. It's not the same as what we have here on earth. And then the basis for the resurrection, which the tradition which is found in the books which are beyond the Torah and which they don't accept and have refused to study. So in his explanation, that resurrected life that he talks about is something that's beyond our present life. It's unlike anything experienced in the present world. And what we have here is Jesus supporting the resurrection of the Jewish tradition as taught by the Pharisees and found in the Hebrew Bible. Jesus' argument is very strong, and as a result, the scribes and the Pharisees both support his response, and the Sadducees end up remaining silent. Here we have a chart which actually highlights for us the differences between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So the Pharisees believe in the law and they believe in interpretations of the Torah. They comprise the middle class of Jewish society. They do believe in the resurrection of the dead and an afterlife. Um, and in regards to the Jewish leaders that were currently in place, they rejected them. Now, the Sadducees, on the other hand, they were the temple priests. They only believed in the Torah. They comprised the upper class. They don't believe in resurrection, nor do they believe in an afterlife, and they supported those Jewish leaders who were put into power by the Roman authorities. The discourse between the scribes and Jesus is typical, and they reflect the kind of discussions and arguments and tensions that we found occurring between the early church and the synagogue. So we're looking at the audience that Luke is writing to. So these debates that are going back and forth are 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 being emulated now within that new early church as they have battles between them and the synagogues and trying to get the Jews on board with what Jesus taught. Those against Jesus want to show that there's nothing to support the claim of his being the long awaited Messiah. So after Jesus answers the three questions that are put to him by those who are against him, Jesus then turns around and asks them a question which they're unable to answer in regard to the Messiah as the son of David. And he's citing Psalm 110 when he refers to that term Lord. And he's referring to himself as the promise of his coming. Once again, Jesus has shown himself to be an authoritative teacher, one whose words should be listened to. Then Jesus takes on the offensive role and he turns on the scribes. He notes that the scribes can read, write, and interpret text just like the Pharisees. And as scholars, they know the Torah and they know the oral tradition. So their roles are very similar to those of a lawyer. In return, they expect all this honor and respect. What's happened now in these discussions that keep occurring is that their badgering of Jesus has proved fruitless. And Jesus is looked to by his disciples to be a teacher. His disciples respect Jesus and what he's teaching. So Jesus now condemns those scribes because they're part of that temple hierarchy. And he's condemning them because they've been using their status and their skills for their own personal gain instead of working with helping the poor and underprivileged. And so he warns them that they haven't been the disciples and that light into the world that God had asked of the Israelites, his chosen people. And so Jesus warns them of a coming judgment, that they will be judged. Here we have an example of the Isaiah scroll. And these are the things that the scribes would be studying and they would be writing. That was part of what they did, is to maintain the books of the Old Testament very meticulously in their copying and recopying of them. Let's take a look at the poor widow's contribution. We'll begin with a reading, chapter 21, verses 1 through 4. Chapter 21, verses 1 through 4. When he looked up, he saw some wealthy people putting their offerings into the treasury, and he noticed the poor widow putting in 2 small coins. He said, "I tell you truly, this poor widow put in more than all the rest, for those others have all made offerings from their surplus wealth, but she, from her poverty, has offered her whole livelihood." Now this scene with the widow takes place in the temple. The coin the widow donates is a lepton, and she's donated 2. A lepton is worth little more than Imagine this, 1/100th of a denarius. And we know that a denarius is equivalent to a day's worth of wages. So the widow is very poor. So what the widow is doing is putting in 1/5 of a day's living in the treasury, and that's her entire income. Remember that when Jesus arrived in Jerusalem, he went to the temple and he cleansed it by removing the money changers and the merchants. He also has berated the scribes for abusing the poor because they were supposed to care for them and address their needs. So what we see now is Jesus, he's upset. He's upset with seeing a poor widow thinking that God's will, because this is what the scribes apparently are teaching, has demanded that she make herself poor. The widow is very generous, but Jesus is teaching that generosity doesn't depend on the amount given, but on the amount withheld, because the wealthy are only giving from their surplus. They're not giving from that amount that they use to support themselves. Jesus then gives a prophecy in regards to the temple, the holy house of God, which we know that Jesus has noted several times has been, overtaken by the greed of these religious leaders. We have the money changers. We have the different things that are going on with the poor pilgrims coming in and trying to pay for unblemished animals for sacrifices. Now, the temple structure itself was begun by Herod the Great in 19 BCE. And so what he did is he rebuilt and expanded the existing structure. So this is during the Second Temple period. And it was actually still under construction during the time of Jesus. That entire renovation and expansion of the Second Temple complex wasn't completed until 64 CE. So it started in 19 BCE and wasn't completed until 64 CE. So it was finally completed in 64 BCE and then totally destroyed just 6 years later in 70 CE during the Jewish revolt when the Romans came in and punished them for rebelling against them. When it was completed, it was considered to be one of the most beautiful buildings in the entire Roman Empire. And as the house of God, the prophecy Jesus makes regarding its destruction, for those listening at that time, would have seemed like, oh my gosh, that's the end of the world. So here we have a lepton, which we refer to as a widow's mite. So think of it as comparable to a penny. And the beautiful temple in Jerusalem, this is a model of what it would have looked like upon completion. And we know that Jesus' prophecy came true in regards to its destruction, totally destroyed in 70 CE when it fell to the Romans. While people are standing around questioning this prophecy in regards to the temple, Jesus describes the extent of the destruction, followed by the signs of the end time. So, very apocalyptic imagery. We have signs such as natural upheavals, earthquakes, disasters, wars, persecution, and a call from Jesus to be vigilant, be ready. So, Jesus is warning them of coming persecutions. Now, for Luke's audience, that early Christian community, they were already facing persecution at home, and also from the rulers in the synagogues and the rulers of the nations. Synagogues were used as places of worship, as a community gathering place, and also as a place of confinement for those awaiting trial. So, as they're following along in this new sect, this Jesus sect, they're facing all sorts of a pushback from the Jews that are following the traditional path and the law of Moses. So these words of Jesus provide hope that their faith and perseverance through all these trials and what in their minds could possibly be the end times will hold them well, because they're the ones that will come into the kingdom of God. Let's take a look at chapter 21, verses 20 through 24. Chapter 21, verses 20 through 24. Now, Jesus is going to provide very specific details here of what's going to become of Jerusalem. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that its desolation is at hand. Then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. Let those within the city escape from it, and let those in the countryside not enter the city. For those days are the time of punishment, when all the scriptures are fulfilled. Woe to pregnant women and nursing mothers in those days, for a terrible calamity will come upon the earth, and a wrathful judgment upon its people. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be taken as captives to all the Gentiles, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And that scene actually took place in 70 CE. It was horrific. Josephus, the Jewish historian, recorded what takes place in terms of the Jewish people. They end up starving when they're under siege. There's cannibalization, there's killing of each other, very brutal behavior as they turn upon each other, the different groups. And then, of course, when the Romans finally are able to breach the wall and enter the city, they continue this rampage of killing and destruction. So what occurred was a Jewish rebellion took place, which was successful, um, and the Romans weren't going to stand for that, and so they sent the Roman general Titus out to deal with this rebellious group in Jerusalem. So they arrive at Jerusalem and they set up a main camp about 1 mile north of Mount Olives at Mount Scopus in the spring of 70 CE. And he establishes a siege wall, just like it's told in the prophecy. And that's normal Roman military procedure when defeating a city. So these verses that we see aren't just specific to 70 CE, they've taken place before. But what is unexpected is Rome's arrival. It's sudden and unexpected. Now, under siege, as I mentioned earlier, that infighting among the Jewish groups ends up reducing their food supplies, so starvation becomes a very major problem for everybody that's locked in the city. Finally, on August 28th, Jerusalem falls to Rome, and any Jewish survivors were taken captive and sold into slavery, and the city and temple were leveled. Tradition also claims that the Jewish Christians in this city fled to Pella, just as the warning tells them to flee at the start of the war. That reference to the time of the Gentiles foretells that missionary movement that we're going to see in the books of Acts. Because remember, as Luke's writing, he's writing one volume looking to the future at the same time he's telling of the past to his Christian audience. So you have quite a bit of imagery of Old Testament prophecies in that reading that we just had. So here we have a scene on the sacking of Jerusalem. The depiction of the Roman triumph here that we see is their celebration of the sacking of Jerusalem, and it's actually found on the Arch of Titus in Rome. And when Jews visit that ancient city of Rome, they'll refuse to this day to walk under that arch. And in this procession, when after destroying the Jerusalem temple, the Romans carted back the menorah and all these other beautiful golden vessels that were found within the temple itself. The first Jewish-Roman war that led to this 70 CE calamity here began in 66 CE, and it resulted because of these ongoing tensions between the Jews and the Romans, and escalated with anti-taxation protests and them attacking the Roman citizens. So the Roman response was to lay siege and execute those those that were rebelling and destroying the city. The siege itself actually took 7 months, and a lot of it was a lot of the rebellion that happened within and this the tensions was fomented by the Zealots, that particular nationalistic part of Judaism. Here we have the Arch of Titus in Rome, and that scene that I showed you. Another image of the Arch of Titus, the arc. And this is General Titus. He was the one that defeated Jerusalem and brought the Jews to their knees. And he was also later on went on to become Roman emperor, and he ruled the empire from 79 to 81 CE. Jesus continues to emphasize that need for vigilance. So what we have now is the coming of the Son of Man, and it's very much couched in those apocalyptic terms. And the coming of the Son of Man will involve the entire world and the universe, the cosmos. The signs are very cosmic. It talks about the stars, the sun, and the moon, along with all these different natural calamities that take place. And similar to the Jews, the people of the world will also have a mixed reaction to Jesus. Some are going to believe, and some are not going to believe. So Jesus gives an end time lesson using the example of the fig tree, telling us that if people can read the signs in nature, for example, when a tree is about to bloom, then they should be ready to read the signs of the coming end times. In closing, Jesus is urging his listeners, his followers, to be vigilant. Don't give up, even though, remember now, Luke's audience is thinking Jesus was going to come, and they realized that he didn't come as soon as they thought. So this audience has been waiting, and when you wait, you begin to move away from that vigilance. So that's why you see a lot of this emphasis in Luke's gospel on staying vigilant. He didn't come right away, but we don't know when he'll come, so we need to stay prepared. We need to stay strong in our faith. So what we're hearing here is a reminder that the coming of the Son of Man will be unexpected and sudden. So we need to be vigilant, prepared, and again the emphasis on the importance of praying. This then ends the public ministry of Jesus. So this concludes the public ministry of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. Let's take a look at chapter 21, verses 37 through 38. Chapter 21, verses 37 through 38. During the day, Jesus was teaching in the temple area, but at night he would leave and stay at the place called the Mount of Olives. And all the people would get up early each morning to listen to him in the temple area. So that's the end of that period of the public ministry. Now, when we get to the Passion, which is what we've now moved into, the key themes that we see are the schism motif, which includes those great reversals, and the victory over over evil. And Jesus is going to be successful in taking back the world from Satan, and he's going to bring glory to all. We're going to look at the conspiracy against Jesus. So 22 verses 1 through 6. 22 verses 1 through 6. Now the feast of unleavened bread called the Passover was drawing near, and the chief priests and the scribes were seeking a way to put him to death, for they were afraid of the people. Then Satan entered into Judas, the one surnamed Iscariot, who was counted among the 12, and he went to the chief priests and temple guards to discuss a plan for handing him over to them. They were pleased and agreed to pay him money. He accepted their offer and sought a favorable opportunity to hand him over to them in the absence of the crowd. So the priests and the scribes are central to the conspiracy. However, Judas is the agent of Satan who's going to strike at the heart of Jesus. What we have now is the building up of the passion. And that term passion refers to suffering. And the scene is going to be one of a human drama, which is going to involve the entire cosmos. In Jerusalem, the city itself, we know, is filled with pilgrims for the Passover. So it's actually, triple, quadruple the normal size, because scholars and archaeologists estimate that the normal population in Jerusalem would be about 50,000, but when these pilgrimages occur, it would swell to several hundreds of thousands. So you can imagine how busy and crowded this city is now for Passover. Historically, Passover goes back to the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and that's an agrarian festival which is celebrated in spring at the time of the grain harvest. Passover itself is a nomadic feast also held in the spring, a time when sheep and goats were moved from the winter to the summer feeding ground. Now, by the time of Jesus, the Jewish practice combined both events, the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Passover, and they combined them both in remembrance of the Exodus from Egypt. Now, for Romans, this annual spring holiday of Passover was a big security risk. There's a lot of people, and there's also this strong sense of nationalism that's taking place because the pilgrimage is linked with the Exodus event, all of which leads to the possibility of mass riots. So the temple leaders are very concerned about the popularity of Jesus and the crowds, many of whom believe he really is the Messiah. Now Jesus sends Peter and John to make arrangements for the Passover meal. And they're told that they're going to meet a man carrying water and they are to follow him. Usually women are the water carriers, so a man carrying the water would have stood out and been readily identified to Peter and John. So what it tells us is that Jesus is in charge and in control of the situation. He knew where he was going to rent a room, and he was aware of the need for secrecy because he's also cognizant of that danger that's surrounding him and facing him. Traditionally, Passover is celebrated with the family. Jesus is now going to celebrate it with his redefined family. And we see this Passover event as being a covenant-making event. And so what happens is Jesus is renewing this covenant, and it becomes grounded in that covenant of sacrifice. This time, the sacrifice provided by Jesus' own death. So the scene provides for us as Christians a template for the Eucharist that we celebrate at Mass. Let's take a look and read this beautiful passage here, chapter 22, 14 through 20. Chapter 22, 14 through 20, the Last Supper. When the hour came, he took his place at table with the apostles. He said to them, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I shall not eat it again until there is fulfillment in the kingdom of God. Then he took a cup, gave thanks, and said, Take this and share it among yourselves. For I tell you that from this time on, I shall not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. Then he took the bread, said the blessing, broke it, and gave it to them, saying, This is my body, which will be given for you. Do this in memory of me. And likewise the cup after they had eaten, saying, This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which will be shed for you. Now in Judaism, the Passover lamb is traditionally sacrificed on the fourth day of the month of Nisan, and that occurs between 2:30 and 5:30 p.m. in the court of the priests. Now Jesus' meal is taking place on the Thursday of that Passover week, which we refer to in Christianity as the Passion Week. The Seder, which is the term for the Passover meal, has 4 blessings of the cup, 2 before the meal and 2 after the meal. In Luke's gospel, it only talks about 2 blessings of the cup. Now, Jesus talks about a betrayer, which we know is Judas, and it creates a stir among his disciples until an argument morphs into an argument about who's going to be the greatest. So Jesus takes a moment to provide a lesson where we continue that theme of reversal. Jesus then provides a model of servant leadership for the disciples. He washes their feet, teaching them by example that in order to further the kingdom, the greater needs to take the lesser role, and that will lead to real greatness in the kingdom. Jesus needs Peter to be strong. However, he also predicts that Peter is going to falter and he's going to deny him 3 times before the cock crows. Jesus needs Peter to support the others, and yet he's predicting that Peter is going to resist. He's going to falter. He warns of a future in which the disciples and the missionaries to come, they're going to meet with violence, hostility, and he symbolizes this by his reference to the sword. So here we have the potential location of the Last Supper. The city of Jerusalem. This is the Dormition Abbey on Mount Zion. And so this site is traditionally the location of what we refer to as the Last Supper in the upper room, the cenacle. Now, the hall of the Last Supper is actually been built over. And so what you see there now is a 12th century Crusader structure. And on the upper level is above what is on the lower level is the traditional place of the tomb of King David. So they built over that. So if you visit Israel and you take the tour, when they take you to this location, on the first level you'll see the Jews going in to pay their respects to King David, and then Christians go up to the top level to look at the location of the Last Supper. Now, archaeological evidence on the lower floor actually reveals an early Roman structure that helps support that this was identified early on as the location of the Last Supper. So the site is actually located on Mount Zion, and it's outside of the old city walls. So you walk through the Dormition Abbey, and on this corner, you turn to the left side, and that's where you would enter into this Last Supper room. And it's what Jesus is doing with renting a room is very common because poor people didn't have the space. They would have and so their homes would be, we talked about their homes earlier, where a lot of times the animals would be on the lower level, they would live on the upper level, and they wouldn't have the luxury of owning a triclinium, a dining room. So if they were having a large gathering such as Jesus is going to do with this Last Supper, it wasn't unusual to rent a room. And now it's Passover, so many people with larger homes would make money or out of hospitality would provide a room for families coming in to share that Passover meal. So his actions make a lot of sense to the audience that he's addressing at the time. So this is what the room of the Last Supper looks like today. Here we have the traditional Passover Seder plate, and you find 6 items. So you have maror and hazara, which are bitter herbs. They symbolize the bitterness and the harshness of the slavery the Hebrews endured in Egypt. And then we have haraset, which is a sweet brown mixture. It's like it's made with chopped up apples and nuts and raisins. and karpas, which is a vegetable of bitter herbs, and it's used and it's dipped into salt. It's and that process takes place at the beginning part of the seder. It could be parsley or celery, and the dipping of the vegetable is in the sea water represents the tears, the pain that was felt by the Hebrew slaves in Egypt. Then they'll have a roasted lamb shank bone. Sometimes they'll just use a chicken wing or a chicken neck as a symbol of the sacrifice. And that roasted hard-boiled egg is also another sacrifice that was offered in the temple of Jerusalem. It's eaten as part of the Seder meal. Eggs are actually the first thing that is served to mourners after a funeral. And so it's a reminder of the mourning that takes place after the destruction of the temple and the inability to offer any further sacrifices at the temple any longer. So it's interesting to look at the history and the symbolism behind those elements on a Seder plate. After the meal, Jesus continues his practice of prayer, and this time it takes place on Mount Olives, and the disciples are with him. Jesus, we're told, is very intense as he prays. He's in an emotional state, so much so that he's actually sweating drops of blood, and that medically can actually occur during times of extreme duress. And so it appears for someone looking at the scene that he's actually on the verge of a nervous breakdown. That blood sweat is described in the scene. That is a medical condition referred to as hematidrosis. It's very rare, but it can actually occur when someone is seriously stressed out. And Jesus has told the disciples to stay awake. Think of all the parables he's been teaching about the importance to be alert, be vigilant. But what happens? They fall asleep. Let's take a look at chapter 22, verses 39 through 46. Chapter 22, verses 39 through 46. Then going out he went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. When he arrived at the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not undergo the test." After withdrawing about a stone's throw from them and kneeling, he prayed, saying, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup away from me. Still, not my will, but yours be done." And to strengthen him, an angel from heaven appeared to him. He was in such agony and he prayed so fervently that his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. When he rose from prayer and returned to his disciples, he found them sleeping from grief. He said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you may not undergo the test." As Jesus prophesied, he's betrayed by one of his disciples. Judas comes up to him with a kiss. That's a sign of friendship. And that was his sign to those that were following him to capture Jesus. So Judas has arrived with the crowd, and including the servant of the high priest. And the disciples, realizing what's happening, one of them, we're told, cuts off the right ear of one of these servants, of the servant. And Jesus actually rebukes the disciple and he heals the ear. So he still performs this miracle here. So what we have being shown to us repeatedly is, despite all of the things that are being done and said about him and the actions against him, Jesus continues a stand of nonviolence. They arrest Jesus, they lead him away, and just as predicted, Peter denies knowing him 3 times before the cock crows. We have Peter sitting in the courtyard. He doesn't want to leave. He wants to see what's going to happen to Jesus. And he's approached at 3 different occasions, and out of fear, he denies Christ. However, Peter, unlike Judas, is going to return in faith to Jesus, demonstrating the power of Jesus' prayer for Peter, that he will be strong and he won't falter. Jesus is then brought before the Sanhedrin, Remember, the Sanhedrin is that Jewish legal body of 70 plus 1, which is the high priest, so a total of 71. And it consists of the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes. Now, they normally meet under the leadership of the high priest, who at that time was Caiaphas, but that nighttime meeting wasn't their traditional gathering. The Sanhedrin themselves, they decide matters on religious and legal issues, but they can't implement capital punishment. Only the Roman authority can do this. So the following morning they meet again, and the punishment for blasphemy is death. And so the accusation that they charge Jesus with is that of blasphemy. So now, to make sure that Jesus is killed, they're going to send him to the Roman court. So here we have the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus would have prayed. And in the garden, you have these very old olive trees. And this one, actually, when Jerusalem was razed to the ground by the Romans in 70 CE, the garden and the trees were destroyed. But soon after, they replanted trees. So this particular olive tree that we're looking at, it would have been dated to that time. And it's a beautiful place, visited by many pilgrims now as they travel to Israel and the Holy Land. It's very peaceful. And here we have first century steps leading to the upper city, which is where Caiaphas's home would have been, and where Jesus might have rented that room. And he would have gone up and down these steps. He would have walked these steps himself, especially on his way to Gethsemane, the garden. So he's taken to the house of Caiaphas. So most likely, Jesus would have taken these steps both ways. The gathering place for where they first captured Jesus and brought him would have taken place in Caiaphas's home. So what we're looking at here are the remnants of Caiaphas's home. So we know that Jesus undergoes 4 different trials. First with the Sanhedrin, then with Pilate, twice with the Sanhedrin. That first night, then again the second night when the second day when the court gathers together. Then he's sent to Pilate, and then with Herod. Because only after daylight could a legal trial take place with the Sanhedrin. So they needed the entire council in order to pass that death sentence. As a ruling power, Rome works with the native populations to help maintain control. And see, this relationship allows Rome to impose their rule through those already in place. So they had a way to manage their massive empire. They establish a relationship with those in control of those places that they've taken rule and dominance over. So in this case, that's going to be the temple priests. So Rome has a mutually beneficial relationship with the temple priests, who are wealthy and powerful. And because it's that Roman era of stability known as Pax Romana, the priest status is very secure. And Rome needs the priests to guarantee their legitimacy, as they help assure that the population that Rome actually is supportive of the Jewish faith, and they allow them to practice their faith throughout the Roman Empire. This also makes it a lot easier for Romans to collect their taxes. So what we have now is Jesus being perceived as a threat to both Rome and the priestly class. He's attracting large crowds who are bringing up the issues of abuse by the authorities, and that implies both the Roman and Jewish leadership. So we have Jesus now brought before Pilate. So let's take a look at chapter 23, verses 1 through 4. Chapter 23, verses 1 through 4. Then the whole assembly of them arose and brought him before Pilate. They brought charges against him, saying, "We found this man misleading our people. He opposes the payment of taxes to Caesar and maintains that he is the Messiah, a king. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He said to him in reply, "You say so." Pilate then addressed the chief priests and the crowds. "I find this man not guilty." But they were adamant and said, "He is inciting the people with his teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee, where he began, even to here." Now, Pilate's residence is where he's normally in residence is at Caesarea Maritima. But both the historian Josephus and the Gospel tells us that Pilate is in Jerusalem, and he would have gone to Jerusalem because it was Passover. He wants to emphasize the Roman presence and their dominance to the crowds, and so that image provides a sense, a form of actual crowd control. Pilate, we hear, questions Jesus, and Jesus' response shows his innocence. Jesus wasn't a common zealot or a rebel. So Pilate decides that he's now going to send Jesus to Herod. And the reason why is Jesus is originally from Galilee. And Herod just happens to be in Jerusalem again for Passover. This scene with Jesus before Herod is only found in the Gospel of Luke. By sending Jesus to Herod, Pilate is showing a diplomatic courtesy to the Jewish client king of Galilee and Perea, because usually Pilate and Herod are at odds with each other. Herod's only interest in Jesus is his desire to see a miracle, because he's been wanting to see Jesus because of the incidences with John the Baptist. But Jesus doesn't engage with him at all. In fact, we're reminded it is faith in Jesus, not curiosity, that is rewarded. If you want a miracle, you have to have faith in Jesus. So the result is Herod and his soldiers, they end up mocking Jesus before they send him back to Pilate, where he is condemned. The scene where Pilate offers the people a choice between the release of Jesus or the rebel Barabbas is only found in Luke. Actually, in Roman historical records, there's no reference to such a custom of releasing a prisoner based on the choice of the people. For us, what it does, the scene provides this image of guilty Barabbas, who is known to be a rebel, as a counterpoint to the very innocent Jesus. And it also highlights the change in attitude of that once welcoming crowd toward Jesus. Just a couple of days ago, they welcomed him with Hosanna, and now they're yelling, "Crucify him, crucify him." Let's take a look at chapter 23, verses 18 through 25. Chapter 23, verses 18 through 25. But altogether they shouted out, "Away with this man! Release Barabbas to us." Now Barabbas had been imprisoned for a rebellion that had taken place in the city and for murder. Again, Pilate addressed them, still wishing to release Jesus. But they continued their shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate addressed them a third time. "What evil has this man done? I found him guilty of no capital crime. Therefore, I shall have him flogged and then release him." With loud shouts, however, they persisted in calling for his crucifixion, and their voices prevailed. The verdict of Pilate was that their demand should be granted. So he released the man who had been imprisoned for rebellion and murder, for whom they asked, and he handed Jesus over to them to deal with as they wished. So what we have here is the Praetorium. There we go. And that originally referred to the general's tents within a Roman military complex. And it later, that term began to be used as the home and a reference to a chief Roman magistrate as the praetor. So there was a special building set aside for that chief leader, governor equivalent. So there we have the Praetorium. And here we have the reconstruction of the Praetorium within Jerusalem. And the scene of Jesus' trial would have taken place before Pontius Pilate. What used to be Herod's castle. Now, archaeologists have determined that it's more likely that Pilate would have judged Jesus at the remnants of the palace, which is actually on the site of the modern citadel within Jaffa Gate. Now, the Roman flagstones that we find here are located in Hadrian's Plaza, and they're part of the stone pavement. And in the Gospel of John, it identifies this location as where Jesus was condemned by Pilate. But again, as we mentioned earlier, the Pilate most likely would have judged Jesus at Herod's palace, which is on the site of what we know as the modern citadel today inside of the Jaffa Gate. So different views as to where it actually took place, but we know it happened within the city of Jerusalem. Crucifixion is a form of Roman execution that's set aside and used for slaves, the subject populations, and also the lowest criminals. Roman citizens were not crucified. Romans kept these vertical shafts for the crosses standing outside the city walls of subject populations, of those places that they've conquered. And it's a very grim reminder and a warning of Roman dominance and what happens to those who come up against Roman rule. And they would use the shafts for crucifixion, so they could be reused. So you imagine as you enter into a city, you see this line of shafts, and sometimes there are still bodies on them. So a very stern warning of how to behave. Now, to add to the shame of crucifixion, the individual that was condemned was stripped naked and made to carry their own crossbeams while the crowds are jeering and taunting and jabbing them along the way. The crossbeam itself usually weighed between 30 and 40 pounds. Now, by the time of the crucifixion for Jesus, he's exhausted. He's weak from hunger and beatings and torment, and it turns out he's not able to carry that beam. And so the Romans force Simon the Cyrene, who's in the crowds, to help carry the beam. They want to make sure that Jesus doesn't die before the crucifixion. So Simon follows Jesus, helping him carry the beam, and it's an image that burns in your vision of model discipleship, carrying that cross. And the moment becomes very important to the Cyrenians, who are part of that early Christian community. In regards to the crucifixion itself, historically, Gnostics is a religious group of Christianity that broke off from mainstream Christianity, a group that actually denied the humanity of Jesus. They claimed that Jesus was swept up into heaven at the crucifixion and that Simon is the one that got nailed to the cross. Just a side note, which was interesting to share with you. For those who are following Jesus, we continue to see that schism motif. Some who are following Jesus on his way to the cross are faithful, and others are not. And Jesus makes a comment to the crowd who are weeping for him. He comments to the weeping daughters of Jerusalem. His comment is forgiveness, despite all that's being done. So for his followers and others, he continues to offer forgiveness. The location of the crucifixion, we're told, is at the place called the Skull. And at the time of Christ, the location for the cross would have been outside the walls of Jerusalem. As I mentioned earlier, the Romans put it outside the city gates of that time as people are entering into a city. It would also have been blasphemous, particularly in a Jewish city, to have anything doing with death or dying within the city walls. Today, the identified location of the cross, referred to as Calvary, it's been worshipped since the 2nd century CE, and over it stands the Basilica of the Holy Sepulchre. And that's been in place since the time of Empress Helena, Emperor Constantine's mother, who, when the Roman Empire became Christian, took on Christianity, very quickly on, Constantine understood the importance of binding the empire together through the faith. And so his mother, Helena, who was Christian, went to the Holy Land to start identifying those key critical sites that relate to Jesus and the beginning of early Christianity. And so she would place shrines over them, and later on, above the shrines were built basilicas. We know in Luke, Jesus is crucified between the two criminals, and we have this dialogue that takes place between the criminals and Jesus, which is only found in Luke's gospel. Let's take a look at chapter 23, verses 39 through 43. Chapter 23, verses 39 through 43. Now one of the criminals hanging there reviled Jesus, saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." The other, however, rebuking him, said in reply, "Have you no fear of God? For you are subject to the same condemnation. And indeed, we have been condemned justly, for the sentence we received corresponds to our crimes. But this man has done nothing criminal." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." He replied to him, "Amen. I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." So here we have the movement of what's taking place. We have the Mount of Olives, the Temple Mount. We know he came in through Bethany and Bethphage. So you have the scene of the ancient city of Jerusalem. And we've got the Holy Church of the Sepulchre, and it covers that point of Calvary. It also covers where we believe the tomb of Jesus is. Here's the palace of Herod, Fort Antonio, which oversees the temple ground, the temple itself. Ancient crucifixion and different methods of crucifixion is depicted here as to how it could have been done. This is the actual remains of a crucified man that was found that dates back to the time frame of Jesus. In this case, apparently, the father actually went and collected his son. Most families, when they had a son or a child that was crucified, because of the shame and fear for themselves, would have nothing to do with the bodies. But this father went and collected his son's bones and put them in an ossuary, which is a bone jar. And so this is part of the ankle bone, so it shows you what the nail would have looked like at the time. These are actual crucifixion nails, which the Romans generally would oftentimes pull out and reuse again. So let's take a look at the death of Jesus, chapter 23, verses 44 through 47. Again, very apocalyptic events are taking place. It was now about noon, and the darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon, because of an eclipse of the sun. Then the veil of the temple was torn down the middle. Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." And when he had said this, he breathed his last. The centurion who witnessed what had happened glorified God and said, "This man was innocent beyond doubt." The eclipse of the sun, that reference is found only in the Gospel of Luke. It's most likely the result of a dust storm, which is common even in the springtime in this part of the world. And that event is very, told to us in very apocalyptic language, which supports the numerous prophetic warnings describing the day of the Lord that we find in the book of Isaiah, chapter 13, in the book of Amos, chapter 8. And that tearing of the temple veil in the Gospel of Luke occurs before the death of Jesus. However, in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, it takes place after his death. The imagery is one adding up, is building the tension that leads to Jesus' death. This is the day of the Lord, and God's presence, his judgment now is centered on the cross. And we see Jesus staying faithful to the scriptures to the very end. He's giving his spirit over to the Father, paraphrasing Psalm 31. So, again, his very Jewishness and his knowledge of those Jewish scriptures and his fulfillment of them all come together in this scene. Truly, he is the Messiah. Now, Joseph of Arimathea, we're told, is a very righteous and virtuous man, and apparently he was a member of the Sanhedrin, but one who did not agree with the decision to crucify Jesus. And he's very concerned that the correct rituals be followed in regards to Jesus and his body. So he's intent on getting Jesus down from the cross and in place before sundown to start a Sabbath. As a member of the Sanhedrin, he has some power and force, and so he's able to actually go to Pilate and insist that the body of Jesus be given to him, and Pilate agrees. So Joseph takes the body, and we're told the body's taken to a tomb where no one else has been buried. So it's not a multiple burial tomb, which was typical of the time. This very caring and loving action on the part of Joseph of Arimathea makes sure, and it follows the legal traditions of Jewish law regarding the burial of the dead. So it means that Jesus isn't totally excommunicated from his own nation. He may have been crucified, but he receives a proper Jewish burial before the Sabbath begins. The women, we're told, who've been very faithful disciples throughout Jesus' ministry, they're at the crucifixion and they're also at the burial. They're witnesses to both the death and the burial of Jesus. So burial practices in the ancient time, this is an example of a tomb. They would have wrapped the deceased in yards of cloth, and then they used large quantities of spices in preparing the body for burial. In fact, in the Gospel of John, it tells us that 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes are used on that first evening of preparing the body. We know in Luke's Gospel that the women will return on the start of the new week to add even more ointments. That they brought that in preparing the body. Here's an alternate location to that of Calvary. It's called the Garden Tomb. It's actually the wrong style of tomb for that era. And part of it being selected and popular with pilgrims is that the reference to Golgotha and a skull. So it looks like the head of a skull. See the eyes. And so that's where that comes from. Now, the location of the crucifixion itself, as we've talked about earlier, is outside of the city gate. And so we have this Basilica of the Holy Sepulchre, which has covered that crucifixion location since the time of Empress Helena. And it's been a pilgrimage site since the 2nd century. So it's a good chart because when you visit Israel and you come to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, it's usually very busy with pilgrims. It's full all the time, and it's overwhelming in its size, and it can be confusing as to what you're looking at as you're taking the tour through the place among the masses of the crowd. So the tomb site itself is thought to be in this area. And the Church of the Holy Sepulchre has been rebuilt a couple of times because of destruction and fires and different events that have gone on. This is where the crucifixion would have taken place, what we refer to as Calvary or Golgotha Rock. So you can see the distance from where the crucifixion took place to where they believe the burial occurred. The stone of unction was found in those burial chambers and is thought to be the actual stone upon which Joseph Arimathea laid Jesus' body and prepared him for his death. And so the custom was that they would wrap the body with these incense and oils and spices, and then wrap the linens around them and lay them on the stone. And then a year later, they would come back and retrieve the bones, and the bones would then be put into the ossuaries or the bone boxes. So that's what's taking place here. So we refer to this as the stone of unction. Many times when you visit, it's covered with people very anxious to lay on it or touch it. Feel the presence of Jesus. These are the burial niches that you'll see at the Holy Sepulchre. And again, this is where the ossuaries would be placed. Now, all four Gospels talk about the empty tomb. Now, Luke's Gospel doesn't include a scene also with the appearance of Jesus in Galilee. So he doesn't take Jesus to Galilee. But all four talk about the empty tomb. Now, the low status of women in society at this time meant they weren't taken very seriously, and they tend to go generally unnoticed. So it's easy for them to come and go without raising suspicion. Hence, we find the women standing at the cross during the crucifixion and watching at the tomb of Jesus. Among the four Gospels, Mary Magdalene is the only common witness, and hence she's considered and referred to as the apostle of the apostles. Now, the women have returned after the Sabbath, and their intent is to properly prepare the dead body of Jesus with the spices, and it's dawn on the first day of the week. And that would be Sunday for the Jews. So they arrive at the tomb only to find that the stone door has been rolled away, and when they enter, that the body of Jesus is missing. So let's take a look at the scene. We're on chapter 24, verses 4 through 12. Chapter 24, verses 4 through 12. While they were puzzling over this, behold, two men in dazzling garments appeared to them. They were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground. They said to them, "Why do you seek the living one among the dead? He is not here, but he has been raised. Remember what he said to you while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified and rise on the third day." And they remembered his words. Then they returned from the tomb and announced all these things to the 11 and to all the others. The women were Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary, the mother of James. The others who accompanied them also told this to the apostles, but their story seemed like nonsense, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb, bent down and saw the burial clothes alone. Then he went home amazed at what had happened. We read that the women are puzzled, and then these two men in dazzling garments appear. And what is the reaction of the women? It's that of fear, followed by bowing their faces to the ground. The women realize these are holy beings, that dazzling gown, and they're messengers, they're angels. They're reminding them of what Jesus had prophesied, and that he would be crucified and he would rise on the third day, which is why he's no longer in the tomb. Jesus has risen. The women share the good news with the 11 disciples, but notice they're not believed. And Peter doesn't believe them either, but he's got to check for himself. And so he finds that, yes, the tomb has been opened and Jesus is gone. The women were told, and their names are listed, are Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary, the mother of James. The response of the women to the angels is not disbelief, but joy. They share the joyous news with the disciples, but their news is met with disbelief. So what we have here is the women continuing to be models of faithful discipleship. They're never questioning who Jesus is. They're never questioning the miracles that are before them. They are with him from beginning to end to resurrection. The Emmaus incident is actually only found in the Gospel of Luke, and we have two individuals, we're told, traveling on this road. They may be a couple, they may be married, because there's reference to a disciple very similar in sounding to the name Cleophas, which is what Luke tells us the name is of one of them. And we know that there's a Clopas, who's the husband of one of the women that's mentioned in the Gospel of John, chapter 19. So they may be one and the same. So it could be, a follower of Jesus, one of the disciples of the 70. So Jesus appears and he explains the events that have taken place as he's walking with them. And he places them within the context of the Old Testament prophecies and Jewish experience. So the passage provides us a balance between the scriptures and also the sacrament of the Eucharist. Let's take a look at chapter 24, verses 27 through 32. Chapter 24, verses 27 through 32. Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them what referred to him in all the scriptures. As they approached the village to which they were going, he gave the impression that he was going on farther. But they urged him, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening and the day is almost over." He went in to stay with them, and it happened that while he was with them at table, he took bread, said the blessing, broke it, and gave it to them. With that, their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. Then they said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he spoke to us on the way and opened the scriptures to us?" The true travelers are filled with faith and joy. They actually saw Jesus. They didn't recognize him because if Jesus told us the resurrection is a very different body in terms of what we know physically on earth. And like the women, they're filled with joy. And like the women, they return to Jerusalem and they share the good news with the 11 disciples and those gathered with them. You notice how we've had this reference to 11? It's a way of Luke reminding us of Judas's betrayal. It also leads to what happens in the book of Acts when they replace the missing disciple with 12. So they're back to the number 12. But twice they've referred to that 11, a very sad reminder that one of the disciples was a betrayer, and that's Judas, and is no longer with them. So here we have this ancient tomb in Israel. And the entrance is normally at burial is closed, and that prevents vandalism and animals from disturbing the bodies. And in this, the Romans, depending on which gospel, would have actually sealed it, but we know that it was broken open. And these stone doors weigh between 1 to 3 tons, so it truly is a miracle that it's been rolled away. It's not something the women could have done on their own. And in regards to the road to Emmaus, well, there's some issues as to which one is truly the Emmaus that we're referring to. We have one location which is about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and that would have been a more likely distance for them to have walked. If they had walked from Jerusalem to Amos, another potential site, it would have been about 20 miles. So walking back and forth to that would have been unlikely. You would have been talking 40 miles in a day versus this particular one here is more likely because 7.5 miles, 14 miles round trip is something which could happen. This is what remains of the road to Emmaus, the Roman road. Now Jesus then appears among the disciples, and we can envision them. Apparently, they were like gathered together. Maybe they were still in that upper room. It sounds like they're huddled in fear because they don't know what to do now that the crucifixion has taken place. Are they going to come after them as the believers of Jesus? And so Jesus appears among the disciples who are talking about what they've heard about what happened on the road to Emmaus. And what is the response of the disciples? It's fear and disbelief. So let's take a look at chapter 24, verses 36 to 43. While they were still speaking about this, he stood in their midst and said to them, "Peace be with you." But they were startled and terrified and thought they were seeing a ghost. Then he said to them, "Why are you troubled? Why do your questions arise in your heart? Look at my hands and my feet, that it is myself. Touch me and see, because a ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you can see I have." And he said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. While they were still incredulous for joy and were amazed, he asked them, "Have you anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of fish. He took it and ate it in front of them. Believing that the resurrected Jesus is a ghost was easier to believe from the disciples than that he had risen. And so Jesus expresses hunger and he eats his fish. And so that's when they finally really get that this is Jesus, the resurrected Jesus. He has fulfilled the prophecy that he's told them over and over again. And so the fish becomes a symbol, and it had been a symbol of abundance, and becomes now equated with the end times and the time of Jesus at the resurrection. So it takes on a very significant symbolic imagery for those Christians then and today. Similar to what took place on the road to Emmaus, Jesus explains his life, his ministry, and his resurrection within the context of the Old Testament prophecies and his experience. And now the role of the disciples are to be witnesses to these events. So this glorified body of Jesus is very central to our Christian belief. Notice the wounds and the blemishes on his body are apparent. And he insists on showing the disciples his hands and his feet, which bear the marks of his crucifixion. So we learn that the glorified body transcends those limits of time and space and the physical. So he's not in pain, he's not bleeding, but it becomes the image of what we understand the glorified body to be. Then we move into the ascension. So the ascension of Jesus provides a bridge between Luke and Acts. And remember, it was originally a one-volume work, which is later broken into two. And Luke's gospel has Jesus leading the disciples from Jerusalem to Bethany, where he blesses them, and then he ascends to heaven. And so we know that the village of Bethany is located on the Mount of Olives. It's about 2 miles east of Jerusalem. And think about this. The last time Jesus was on the Mount of Olives was during his agony, followed by the arrest. And so it was a time filled with the darkness of Satan. And now, here we have Jesus again on the Mount of Olives, but this time, he's triumphed over the dark power of Satan. Amen. So here we have the beautiful Mount Olives today. And we have the ancient cemeteries covering the Mount of Olives. So Jewish people are buried here. So all of these stones are the stones for burial sites. And as a result, when you look at the Mount of Olives, because it's the white stone of Israel, very bright. It stands out. It truly is a light. So let's take a look at our reflection questions. First one, describe Jesus' authority. How does he exercise authority over you and your church today? 2. How did Jesus respond to injustice in his trial? How do you respond to injustice? 3. What does it mean to you that the veil of the temple was torn? And 4. In what ways are you carrying out the mission Jesus gave the church? I want to thank all of you for taking part in this series. I hope you found yourself spiritually enriched as we journeyed through the Gospel of Luke together. I wish each of you a blessed day. Please join me now as we close in the prayer our Father taught us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen.